Hello. In this video, we are going to talk about Emmanuel Levinas, a philosopher of the 20th century from France. Levinas has commented on many strands of Western philosophical traditions, including the thought of Plato, Descartes, Hegel, and Heidegger, all of whom he critiqued but also sought to find value or insight in their ideas. Levinas has had a great influence on other thinkers, including Jacques Derrida, who owes some of his most important concepts, including the concepts such as the other and the trace, to Levinas. Levinas sometimes is also characterized as a postmodernist because, along with other recent philosophers, he has questioned the tradition's privileging of reason, conceptual knowledge, and certain kinds of metaphysical systematization. He is also called a phenomenologist because he uses some of the methods of Husserl and Heidegger in observing and analyzing human consciousness. But though he has been given many labels, Levinas is most often associated with the word ethical. Some people prefer to call him ethical postmodernist because of his emphasis on and the concern with what he calls the ethical or social relation. The relation with the other, meaning the other person. Levinas shows persuasively how the various aspects of human experience are founded upon and bear traces of the primordial relation with the other, who brings the self into being by calling it to responsibility and service. By speaking, the other reveals to me his or her exteriority and infinity. The other cannot be reduced to a concept other. The word other is normally capitalized in the English translation, which stands for the French autrui, which means the other person, someone else, someone other than oneself. It is thus the personal other, the other person, whoever it is, that each of us encounters directly or experiences the traces of every day. Of course, we encounter a multiplicity of others, but Levinas more often uses the singular other to emphasize that we encounter others one at a time, face to face. Levinas was born in the year 1906 in Lithuania and died in 1995. His parents were Jewish, and in his youth Levinas read the Hebrew Bible. He studied also the Russian language in early education. Then he became fluent in German and in French. He has many encounters with many important philosophers during his lifetime. Some of his important books are Existence and Existence, the Theory of Intuition in Husserl's Phenomenology, Discovering Essence of Husserl and Heidegger. However, the most important work which gave him reputation was Totality and Infinity, published in the year 1961. Later, he also published another important work titled Otherwise Than Being Beyond Essence in the year 1974. In the year 1982, he again published another important work titled Of God Who Comes to Mind. One of the important contributions of Levinas is his major idea that ethics is the first philosophy. Levinas sought with his philosophy to completely leave behind the parameters of thought articulated by Heidegger and to go entirely beyond being, a true break with all forms of ontology. The goal of Levinas' philosophy was to posit ethics in the place of ontology as the first philosophy. That is to say, to make ethics the basis for all subsequent thought. The key to this objective or this goal is his notion of the other. an idea also extensively written by Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Levinas also wants to show how complex the notions of obligations, responsibility, and desire are when we juxtapose with the notion of the other. For Levinas, responsibility is only made possible through face-to-face relations in which desire for the other is felt. These relations are emblematic of his view of oppressed modern existence. He writes of this modern existence as mal du siècle, which means a malaise of existing or a sickness unto being, echoing the sentiments felt throughout Sartre's great novel Nausea. He tries to confront the horror of living in a world without hope, which demands an escape from being. Our first response in the confrontation with the other is to kill the other in order to affirm ourselves. Yet it is impossible to ignore the autonomy of the other, and in this manner, responsibility is brought to the fore. It is solely through the other that morality and ethics can be properly formed. One of the keys to this idea is that Levinas calls being itself into question and asks, does being suffice for itself? According to Levinas, being itself is a source of tragedy and desperation resulting in the barbarism of civilization. He writes, I quote him, "The insufficiency of the human condition has never been understood otherwise than as a limitation of being." End quote. It is an overinvestment in this being that causes disinterest in the ethical. This disinterest and aforementioned malaise are what lead to the need for escape, a desire which Levinas calls a fundamental part of human existence. Being gives rise to both shame and disgust within ourselves as we strive to affirm our own being. All of our life's projects inherently leave numerous possibilities unrealized. Thus, the escape sought does not have a true object as such, but is much more akin to the existential angst Heidegger wrote of in his essay, What is Metaphysics? What is left is a feeling that can never truly be gotten rid of, leaving the flight from being ultimately impossible. In this way, we feel trapped within the constraints of being and sometimes experience a revolt. Even though it is impossible, escape remains an internal possibility of being to which it is held captive. The only path to transcendence, according to Levinas, is love, which supersedes both desire and pleasure. One of the important concepts that Levinas uses in his writings is the notion of the face. For Levinas, there can be no doubt that human relation begins the encounter with the face. This face-to-face relation is the basis for all other discourses in the society. By face, Levinas means the human face. The word in French is le visage, but not thought of or experienced as a physical or aesthetic object. Rather, the first usual unreflective encounter with the face is as the living presence of another person. So face stands for the living presence of the other. Thus, when we come face to face with another person, the experience is social and precisely ethical. It is far from intellectual, aesthetic, or physical. Living presence for Levinas would imply that the other person is exposed to me. The other person is vulnerably present before me. The other person expresses himself or herself just by being there as an undeniable reality that I cannot reduce to images or ideas in my head. This impossibility of capturing the other conceptually or otherwise reveals the other's infinity. The other cannot be reduced to a finite, bounded entity over which I can have power. The other person is, of course, exposed and expressive in other ways than through the literal face. the other person is also expressed through speech, gesture, action, etc. But the face is the most exposed, most vulnerable, and most expressive aspect of the other's presence. Levinas therefore wants philosophy to begin with this relation, the face-to-face relation. And this relation comes with an ethical demand. That is, before the face of the other, I shall not kill, and in fact, I have to defend the life of the other. As we encounter the face of the other, we cannot escape from this ethical command. It is inescapable. We cannot respond to the face of the other whom we encounter, and this response always comes with our responsibility for the other. For Levinas, to be responsible is to be responsible for the other. Therefore, Levinas brings philosophy down from abstract ideas into concrete experience concerned with the need of the other. At the moment I face the other, I cannot release myself from this ethical relation. I have to be responsible for the other at the level of basic material needs. In the act of facing the other, I cannot hide myself from the other. I cannot enjoy my life within myself alone, because an act of facing here is an openness of the self to the other without return to the self. This concrete situation moves the self to be responsible for the other. Therefore, the ethical relationship is prior to any system of moral thinking. When Levinas mentions the numerous teachings from the Bible, especially as he refers to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 25, he reminds us about the way we treat the other in the way we treat God. The infinite is revealed through the other. He always refers to the Jewish proverb, the other's material needs are my spiritual needs. Ethical relation for him begins with the response to the other's material needs. To feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give drink to the thirsty, give shelter to the homeless are my responsibilities. Holiness therefore begins with practical morality. And practical morality is essentially based on ethical relation, face-to-face relation with the other. And this relation cannot be abolished from human relationship. Therefore, according to Levinas, responsibility is not conditioned by any knowledge. Indeed, it happens at the moment we encounter the face of the other. The ethical responsibility is prior to any knowledge of the other. In other words, I have to be responsible for the other even though I do not know him or her. In the words of Levinas, I quote, I understand responsibility as responsibility for the other, thus as responsibility for what is not my deed or for what does not even matter to me, or which precisely does matter to me, is met by me as face. End quote. Before the other, we have no choice and we cannot escape from our responsibility for the other. Again, he says, I quote, to discover in the I such an orientation is to identify the I and morality. The I before the other is infinitely responsible. End quote. If the other is beyond any limit and grasp, then responsibility is limitless. Levinas, therefore, uses the term infinite responsibility to denote this responsibility of ours for the other. Before the other, I have no choice. I have to be responsible for the other. To escape from this responsibility is impossible. Therefore, he says, I quote, to be an I then signifies not to be able to slip away from responsibility. End quote. He talks firmly about this inescapability by mentioning the story of a prophet by name Jonah mentioned in the Bible. Jonah could not escape from his duty to God, and God commanded him to go to Nineveh and warn people about the divine punishment for their evil doings. But for Jonah, the people of Nineveh were considered as the other, and they were not of any concern for him. He wanted to deny God's command. According to Levinas, we cannot be free from responsibility just as Jonah could not escape from his responsibility for the other. Jonah could not deny his responsibility for the people of Nineveh, even though he wanted to escape from this responsibility. This ethical responsibility is not a reciprocal relationship where we ask something in return. This asymmetrical relationship initiates God's mercy on the people of Nineveh. Jonah ought to perform his responsibility without any expectation from them in return. For Levinas, the asymmetry of the ethical relationship is very important for human relationships. It does not imply demanding the other's responsibility for me. My responsibility for the other does not mean the other will do the same in turn. The model is not that of Tsar's mother, who, according to the story of Levinas says to a dying soldier, "You must be very happy to die for your country." For him, this is a demand from the other. Responsibility is not a demand from the other. It is an asymmetrical relation, the departure from the self to the other without any return to the self. Levinas is very fond of quoting Dostoevsky's novel The Brothers Karamazov, where he says, "We are all responsible for everyone else, but I am more responsible than all the others." Another important concept in Levinas' philosophy is the idea of subjectivity. To be responsible for the others is, according to Levinas, essentially to be a substitution for the other. Being a substitution means to put myself in the place of the other, not to appropriate him or her according to my wishes, but to offer to the other what he or she needs, starting with basic material needs. To be a self is to substitute for the other. To be the self does not mean an end in itself, but departs from the self to the other without any return to the self. To substitute for the other is to leave oneself for the other. It is to transcend one's egoism. In his famous book, Otherwise Than Being and Beyond Essence, Levinas says, I quote, "Responsibility, the signification of which is non-indifference, goes one way from me to the other. In the saying of responsibility, which is an exposure to an obligation for which no one could replace me, I am unique." End quote. Concerning this substitution, I am unique and no one else can replace my responsibility. And this responsibility for the other stems from the alterity of the other. The uniqueness of the other cannot be reduced to the same genus. This is the ethical relation of the uniqueness of the self to the uniqueness of the other. Levinas seems to put ethical responsibility as a substitution for and a hostage of the other prior to any other philosophical concepts. This is the priority of ethical responsibility over ontology and epistemology. According to Levinas, responsibility precedes freedom. We know that for Sartre, our responsibility follows freedom. For Sartre, human person creates his or her own essence through his freedom. And freedom is essentially what exists within our existence. Levinas takes account of freedom in a way that is very different from Sartre. He says, I quote, "We must emphasize here the fact that freedom is not first. The self is responsible before freedom, whatever the paths that lead to the social suprastructure. Freedom can here be thought as the possibility of doing what no one else can do in my place. Freedom is thus the uniqueness of that responsibility." For Sartre, human person is condemned to be free, but for Levinas, existence is not condemned to freedom, but judged and invested as a freedom. Freedom could not present itself all naked. Freedom for Levinas does not mean that I am free to do anything according to my will, as I am an autonomous being. but freedom implies my responsibility for the other, and it questions me before the exercise of my freedom. Levinas' idea of responsibility is a radical turn away from the notion of Sartre's being for itself to being for the other. To be responsible is also to be responsible for the freedom of the others, as well as to be responsible for the responsibility of the other. Let us now try to look at critically some of the ideas of Levinas. Levinas' ethics begins the moment I encounter the face of the other. Ethics in this sense seems to apply only to personal affairs, but I do not live with a single other. I live with people in a society where the other's other is also met. I need to know who is the first other, and then knowledge and moral guiding principles are required in practice. Levinas acknowledges this when he says, but in the real world there are many others. When others enter, each of them external to myself, problems arise. Who is the closest to me? Who is the other? Perhaps something has already occurred between them. We must investigate carefully. Legal justice is required. There is need for a state. That is the quotation from Levinas himself. Levinas' ethics would be absolutely sufficient if he lived in a paradise situation where there are only two, you and me, and I could not evade my responsibility for you. But we do not live in the paradise. More than ethics is required in order to be good, justice is also required. We wonder whether Levinas' ethics works appropriately even for just two persons in a paradise situation. If Levinas realizes the limits to his ethics, why does he deny to move beyond this limit? He himself confesses this in an interview he had with Philip Nemo. He says, my task does not consist in constructing ethics, I only try to find its meaning. So ethics for Levinas is a critique. If it is just a critique, especially of the Western tradition, what is supposed to be the guiding principle to do good when the third person appears? What is the criterion by which one can weigh between the two others whom we encounter? For Levinas, the question of justice that we have to weigh is the first violence. Levinas says, I quote him, only justice can modify that, in that justice brings this being delivered over unto the neighbor under a measure, or tempers it by thinking it in relation to the third or fourth, who are my other as well. Justice is already the first violence. End quote. If justice is the first violence, how does society escape from this first violence? We do not find the way out of this violence in its ethics. Nonetheless, a just society needs this violence. Levinas dares not to jump into this form of violence, but social problems always need to be weighed in order to be solved. Levinas once said, I quote, I do not believe that pure philosophy can be pure without going to the social problem. But his ethics seem to keep the status of pure ethics for the self and the other without progressing to the problem in society where there are more than the self and the other. He seems to believe in the untransferability of ethics to politics. His ethics then is always before politics, and he still keeps the separation between ethics and politics. The fact that Levinas maintains this separation between ethics and politics presents an essential problem for Derrida. To conclude, unlike many thinkers, Levinas does not separate philosophy from religion or religion from philosophy. For Levinas, philosophy has to give service to the love for the other. This is a different perspective of the Western tradition and the meaning of philosophy and ethics. This seems to be a new invention of the meaning of the Greek terms of both philosophy and ethics. His refusal to move ethics to accomplish universal principle because his ethics demands only from himself, not from the other, on the basis of asymmetrical relation in which there is no reciprocity or without expecting from the other anything in turn. His ethics denies the possibility to assimilate the other into generality. And this form of ethics is at the personal encounter between the self and the other. This is why I could not speak for the other or impose the law onto the other. But for Levinas, as soon as the third person appears on the stage, ethics and justice, asymmetry and equality come into play in the scene. Then for his ethics, Greek philosophy is indispensable. Thank you very much.